Coming up on the Mouth Check, the debate is, have GLP-1s changed dairy forever? Our second debate is, will cheese remain king? Welcome to the Mouth Check from TC Jacoby and Company, your complete guide to dairy markets, from the milking parlor to the supermarket shelf. I'm Ted Jacoby. Let's dive in. Excited for our topic today. We are going to have a debate. The debate is, have GLP-1s changed dairy forever? The demand for protein right now is clearly extremely strong. It's really a question of whether we think this demand for protein is a fad or we think it's a fundamental shift in demand that's going to be with us for a long time. And so I'm going to actually put Mike Brown on the spot first. Mike, has GLP-1s changed dairy forever?
It certainly changed me forever, and I'm a big eater of dairy for a long time. I've had good success with GLPs getting my weight to where it needs to be. And one thing you do discover is that you do need to really watch your protein intake. You need to make sure you're getting adequate amounts because you will lose muscle. I think diets in general, we're becoming less carb focused. We're becoming more protein focused. So I don't see it going away. Does that mean we'll have the record high prices we have now forever? Probably not. The markets will stay strong, and I think it's a shift in consumer demand. You just need to go into any Costco or Sam's Club, and the amount of protein beverages they offer now versus 3 years ago, they've tripled in some cases. So it's definitely a market of strength. And despite the high price of proteins, people still seem to be buying it. I'll see limits when there's sales in different stores, which tells you that demand is still extremely strong.
Josh, I'll ask you next. Are we changing demand forever, or is this a fad?
I don't know that GLP-1s are necessarily what's changing demand forever, but they definitely are a catalyst and a disruptor right now. We were listening to a High Ground monthly update earlier today. I'll echo something that was said during that update. A health and wellness trend is absolutely happening, is global. They noted and cited in that over the last 2 years, gym memberships have been up in the U.S. If you go to other parts of the world that we export products to that GLP-1s haven't yet reached, we're seeing incredible health and wellness movements and protein consumption uptake. So what I think the GLP-1 aspect of it is doing is that it served as a bit of a catalyst and ignited this market and forced us all to recognize this shift that we're seeing from just calories taken in to quality of calories taken in. And that is driving a lot of incremental protein demand that the dairy space is a benefactor of to date. So I don't know if I really answered it, Ted. I think GLP-1 is a catalyst and forcing us to recognize a bigger trend that we're seeing not only in the US, but globally.
I do think it's pretty important to talk about the time horizon that we're discussing, because there's a really big difference in both availability and dietary preference of protein sources globally, right? Like India, Sub-Saharan Africa, even China, up until very recently, was very plant protein based. And so even though protein consumption as a whole has certainly been growing, where you are looking at depends on how much that's actually impacting animal proteins. And so I think that time horizon is important, right? Because we know where population growth is occurring worldwide. Population growth worldwide is actually in areas that are plant protein consumers, not animal protein consumers. And you're getting some animal protein consumers actually trending lower on population, right? You look at the population outlook for a lot of Europe. Korea was in the middle. I think they're like 50-50, if I recall, on plant versus animal proteins. But I think that time horizon is a pretty important piece of the discussion.
So Jake, I'll ask you the question. So 5 years from now, are we going to be looking back on 2025 and 2026 and talk about the whey protein fad? Or do we think that we will have seen a fundamental shift in where people have invested their investment dollars in terms of what kind of dairy production facilities, processing facilities have been built in the US and around the world?
5 years is way too short of a timeline to see what I would call a freight train changing its course. And so I think that's pretty clear. We know what's going to be happening with U.S. exports, right? We are just set up to be the export powerhouse in the short term. And I would call 5 years short term for trends like this. Even though this has happened very fast, knowing again what is happening with the U.S. export picture, I don't think there's any way we see a material change in what's happening in the protein space in a 5-year period.
I think there's one point of difference in milk proteins versus whey proteins. I think we see, because of cost difference, I think more interest in finding how can I use milk proteins in a product versus whey. I noticed this weekend, again, looking at a sports beverage, that 30-gram protein, number one ingredient is milk, and it's not a Fairlife product. It's an amalgamated product.
Couldn't agree more. I was certainly one level higher in just saying any dairy protein or animal protein for that matter. But yeah, when you drill down, do I think there could be ships within that makeup? Absolutely.
The other thing is with whey proteins is that you got to sell the cheese or you got to sell the casein. And as we look at that spread in price, what's that value of that whey protein worth versus what you get for the remaining part of the product? As we know right now, class 4, which is even dry milk powders, and fat are worth way more than milk for cheese, even when you adjust for the higher protein revenues. We have a $5 spread right now between class 3 and class 4. And that always takes care of itself, but exactly how it will, I think we all know there's interest in, do I add casein producing capacity so I can get to my whey proteins rather than just cheese? If I make those caseins, where's the market for those products? Where am I going to be able to use them? So I think there's lots of questions that we don't know yet, because if I'm a processor, one very high value product, whether if it's a half a pound or 3/4 of a pound yield per 100 pounds of milk, it's not going to drive all your decisions. It's going to be a factor.
Gus, I'm going to ask you the question, has GLP-1 changed dairy forever? Or do you think it's a trend?
I'm of the impression that we're certainly following the trends within Western culture to evaluate more and more the health benefits of eating better nutrition. And certainly as time moves on, the protein component in your meal is going to be more and more important. So I'm not going to take away from that. I think that will continue to evolve, but I also think that as we continue to evolve in that setting, other pieces of that nutrition will come to light and become the fad for a period of time. At the moment, protein is hot, and I don't think we can get away from that. For me, just looking at U.S. milk production and how much of that milk production goes into cheese, the ever-increasing demand in cheese, I don't see that going away either. I think that's an entrenched part of our society, and I think cheese is a pretty important part of the daily food consumption here in our culture as well. I think there's a place for both of them, and it's hard for me to distinguish one from the other as being where we go as an industry.
One thing we may see is more of these protein-based dairy beverages that aren't class 1 milk take more and more of that consumer stomach. And so we're going to see more of those UF-based products, which aren't necessarily what we think of traditionally as fluid milk. And that's where a lot of the growth has been in the high-protein milks. Is that where the substitution will take place as much as in some other ways?
I don't think there's any doubt, Mike, but I would also argue that we're probably going to eat into that class 1 consumption a bit by more of this dairy protein shake, which tends to be in the class 2 area.
That's what I meant. They're going to drink it as a class 2 product. It all gets down to how regulation basically makes those products more competitive because of the regulated minimum price.
That would be a very interesting discussion probably for another day relative to what we want to cover in our debate today.
Yeah, it's a bit of a nerd fest, but we look at consumption trends. It isn't hurting the high protein products because they are priced differently.
Yep.
Diego, what are your thoughts? This demand for protein fad or a long-term trend?
I think the trend is clear and it still has a lot of room to grow. So I think in a 5-year period, it's very easy to say that they're going to continue to grow.
You see the international space a lot more clearly than most of the rest of us. What's happening here in the U.S., is it happening internationally as well?
Yes, and that's why I said that there's going to be growth, because I still see areas of Latin America where that trend is just getting started. You still do not see any of the products that you're seeing in the U.S. at the supermarket showcasing and marketing that much the protein content on the end product. So I think that growth is still getting started.
Joe, last but not least, bad and long-term trend.
I think that the consumer shift is a long-term trend. I don't know if necessarily the GLP-1 is the long-term trend, because technology will continue to advance and there'll be something that comes out at some point that makes this old news. I think that the health and wellness trend is certainly here for the foreseeable future. They're estimating 40 million people within the next 5 years are going to be on GLP-1s. That's a big number. The one thing we've seen the effect on selfishly for my market is the amount of cream and fat that it's spun off because of all the demand for the protein. We did not expect to have this fundamental shift in the fat market domestically this quickly. unless the farmers decide that they're going to change how they feed their cows and produce less fat, we're going to see that for a while too, or we're going to be surplus fat. And that product is also affected by this GLP-1 because people tend to eat less sweets and snacks and fat-heavy products. So consumption's been down on that side as well.
It's going to be interesting. And I'll just give my 2 cents. I do think the demand for protein is a long-term trend. I think it's a trend both within certain segments of the population, and I think it's a trend in that I think just comparing my generation and how I ate and drank in my 20s compared to how my children eat and drink in their 20s, they sure do live a healthier life than I did when I was that age. And I think I'm speaking for a good portion of that generation and not just my kids. So we'll see. It sounds to me that the consensus is pretty clear on this one. Whether it's GLP-1s or not, this protein trend is a long-term trend, and it is fundamentally changing the dairy industry. And we're all curious to see how it'll play out. All right, now I'm going to switch to our second debate. This debate is, will cheese remain king? So in my lifetime, milk production, when I was born, milk production was roughly 20% of milk was made into cheese. Today, it's 55%. It is very clear that the driver in dairy consumption in the United States is a per capita increase in cheese that is part of a long-term trend. My question for everybody today is, have we started to reach the point where that trend is starting to plateau? Is cheese still king? Will it continue to be the driver of increases in per capita dairy consumption? Or have we reached a point where we're not going to see cheese driving the bus anymore? It's 55% of milk production goes into cheese today. Is it going to be 65% in 10 years? Or is it still going to be in the 50s? Gus, I'm going to throw you out there first. What are your thoughts?
I think it's hard to say that it isn't still king, considering the large amount of milk in U.S. milk production that goes into cheese. And even with respect to the protein segment that we just talked about, you can't make whey without making cheese. So you're not going to get whey protein without cheese. I don't think the American consumer is going to lose their appetite for cheese anytime soon. I understand that certainly with the GLP-1s, we're going to eat a bit healthier. But I find it hard to believe that while maybe the growth might become less than it has been over the last number of years, I do believe that cheese is going to be with us as the majority taker of milk, at least for the foreseeable future.
Do you think the trend is strong enough that 15 years from now, 65 or 70% of all milk goes into cheese? Or do you think maybe we're going to plateau right around here at 55%?
I think it still has room to go a little bit higher. I think there's a possibility of plateauing, though, maybe at some point north of 60. But at the end of the day, I just don't see how it can be removed from the diet. If people want to start playing with what type of cheeses are in their diet for better health benefits, I guess that may happen, not in the near term.
Jake, what are your thoughts?
I would imagine that the percent of milk that is turned into cheese goes lower. That's my gut feel. We're going to be export dominated. We maybe can capture some markets that we haven't historically gotten into before with more shelf stable products. We're just gonna have to export a lot of product. Cheese is exportable, obviously, but it just feels with the new markets we're going to be moving into, the amount of product as a percent that we're going to be exporting, dietary shifts, it all points to me that as a percent, it's hard for me to make the case that cheese goes higher. And so by default, I'll argue it goes lower.
Joe, what are your thoughts?
I think that what happens with cheese moving forward depends on how well the dairy industry markets cheese moving forward. If we do a better job of marketing the protein benefits, the fact that it's the cheapest protein per gram, and playing into those strengths, that would help keep it as king and increase consumption. If we continue to sit on our laurels and not really do any additional marketing, I think that we have a chance to lose capacity.
So what's your gut? Do we do a good job marketing it or not?
I don't think we do. But we could. The potential is there. We're not doing it.
I think dairy has struggled for a long time just to market itself as how healthy it is. And some of that, I think, is because we sit in a position of strength in the marketplace. And so everybody's always coming after dairy to say they're better than dairy and dairy's got issues. So all the plant guys can grow their plant-based products. All of those food products that don't come from dairy tend to attack dairy in order to grow their own market share. And I think that's why dairy struggles. I think your point about how the value of a gram of protein in cheese is a lot less than the same cost of that protein, let's say in whey powder or in other things. I'm curious to see how that plays out because I think it's a really good point.
I make a point on the competition where we've seen shrinkage in the refrigerated dairy case is the non-dairy beverages. They're losing market share. Milks are doing better, particularly the protein milks are doing so much better. I think there is still potential, so we can't assume that. I also think there's two questions on cheese to me, market share and total market. I think total market still has a little room to grow. I think market share will not grow, maybe decline modestly. And that's more because of the class 2 demand for proteins now with yogurt, Greek yogurts and cottage cheese, and all the class 2 based liquid beverages. So it's more of an issue perhaps of market share. And that takes time to build capacity. We all know that. But the demand is there. Cheese is going to continue. We look at the supermarket sales data. It's still growing modestly, as is butter. And that's just total sales. I think the other factor you got to think about here is population growth, because our growth is going to be much slower. With current immigration policies, I don't see a quick turnaround in growth of population like we've experienced in the past. A lot of that from folks who are big users of dairy in their diet. In the benefit of cheese, as we get older, we drink less and we eat more bulk proteins, and that's part of our growth, of course, with cheese. The other one is food service. It's huge, particularly in the mozzarella side of the business, and it's looking pretty tepid right now. That tends to go with healthy economy. I expect it'll rebound again when people have more money to spend. I think that's part of it too. So cheese is going to remain strong. Jake made a very good point, though, as did Joe. It's kind of sold itself, and we've had no trouble selling it. We are now the export market, kind of like we did with non-fat dry milk, 20 years ago, Josh? We're dependent on that export market. So it makes us more vulnerable to world price longer term, but it also means it's a chance to grow if our industry adapts to meet those demands. And as we see, everything from powders to butter to cheese, the industry is working on that. But it's a slow process because it's always been that market when we have a little extra, it was an opportunistic market. Now it's becoming part of sales strategy, and that's a very different way to look at your business.
Yeah, it means it's really matured.
Yes, a lot.
Diego, what are your thoughts? I know you're not the cheese guy, you're more of the ingredient guy, but internationally, cheese is definitely growing. Cheese going to remain king, or is the other protein sources going to take over and pull milk away from cheese?
So I have contradicting thoughts here. I think that everybody here agrees that the demand for WBCs and WBIs is going to continue growing. And that's definitely been making cheese plants very profitable. But at the same time, I'm seeing that many cheese plants being built in the past few years that I think that the competition is going to get fierce in that aspect. I would say in the coming years that I see more probabilities of people who build and companies who build dryers, for example, for non-fat and skim, to have an advantage and definitely a good incentive.
So my 2 cents is this. I think we are underestimating how much the export demand for cheese is going to keep driving it. There's a lot of proof that cheese consumption in developing countries tends to follow a generation or two after milk powder consumption. It starts with infant formula, then tends to stay in the diet as they get older, but eventually manifests itself in cheese, mostly as an ingredient in something like pizzas or burgers, etc. And so I do think cheese demand for cheese out of the U.S. will continue to grow. I do think the curve will flatten a little bit. I also think that you are going to get a continued pressure to build more cheese plants just so you have access to the whey protein, because I think the whey protein is going to maintain its value. But I'm a little bit like Diego, because on the other side, one of my thoughts is I hear a lot of conversations lately about, instead of making cheese, what if we make micellar casein and we pull the native whey and then we dry the native whey separately? So I can also see technology continuing to evolve where maybe you don't actually need to make cheese in order to have access to the whey proteins. And I think we have to keep our eye on that. But I do think cheese is the dominant use for milk in the United States. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but I do think the trend is probably going to start to slow down a bit. Josh, what are your thoughts?
I want to step back a bit and start with one belief. And that belief is that United States dairy economies of scale have now reached a point where we're going to grow in our market share for the global dairy consumption. We're going to continue to grow in our participation in that business, and we will capture more market share. And if you believe that, at its core, cheese is maybe one of the, if not, it's the most calorie dense product that we have. And there's an argument that it goes into products as both ingredients and as the primary food service or retail product, which accesses a lot of different demand potential. If you think about the cheese factory, maybe not how they're run today, but if you think about it, I've made the mistake multiple times of saying that we're going to start balancing the cheese. And there's been a big argument about that internally. And I can understand why there's an argument on the surface level, but on the bigger picture, it's what may be the most versatile way to process milk and balance out whether we have extra protein, extra fat, or we're short of either of those products or whatnot. You can spin off more cream. You can bring in more solids. You really optimize that recipe. And I feel like that makes it foundational. And if it's foundational, you're going to continue to see investment in these large cheese plants. If whey protein's hot, great. Whey protein benefits and cream prices are poor, it's offsetting. If cheese demand globally is growing or fat demand is growing, great. We'll maneuver our recipe a bit to take advantage of that. It feels very optimized, maybe is not the right word. Someone help me with the word for it, but it feels like it's a natural hedge. And it just seems we're going to continue to grow in the commodity foundation of dairy products and then optimize all the ingredients and all the special opportunities around it. The cheese processing facility is maybe going to be the best to build around. And so with that in mind, I don't know if that necessarily takes a greater market share, but it's going to be the foundation for our growing volume of milk solids out of the U.S. over the next several years.
You know, Josh, it's funny. You mentioned, are we going to start balancing into cheese versus balancing into a powder plant? And my initial reaction when you first mentioned it a year or so ago was to say, a cheese plant is just way too expensive. It's 2-3 times the cost to build a cheese plant as it is to build a plant that dries non-fat. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to realize this. Already today, we've seen a fundamental shift that will continue. I think cheese will always get enough milk to run the plant. But the competition for that marginal next pound of milk that could go to any of those plants, I think the competition for that last pound of milk has been ratcheted up a notch or two. And I don't think cheese is going to win that battle at all costs like it historically has. And so I think there are times when your UF milk plants, when your ESL plants, and even when your non-fat butter plants are going to win that competition from time to time. And so the balancing function for a milk supply is going to start getting spread over the course of multiple plants rather than the way we've been over the last 50 years where everything was balanced in and out of a milk drying plant. All right. So if we come to a conclusion, is cheese king? Let's just go around. Is cheese going to stay king? Mike, is cheese going to stay king?
Cheese will stay king, but the strength of its kingdom will be a little weaker because it's going to have some strong competition from other proteins.
Perfect. Jake? Couldn't have said it better.
I agree completely.
Gus?
I would agree with how Mike said it.
Awesome. Joe?
Yeah, no argument here.
Diego?
I'll have to say no. It's because of the high competition and the amount of plants that are being built right now.
So are you saying you agree or disagree?
I disagree.
It's the degree that cheese is ahead. It's going to take a lot of time for that to shift.
A little bit, like the Roman Empire in the year 200 AD. It's still got 250 years to go, but it's no longer going to be the powerhouse it was 50 years previous. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, cheese is the king, and we're going to build a bigger kingdom around it.
All right. And I agree with the general consensus that the cheese stays king, but the trend of an ever-increasing percentage of the supply is starting to slow down a bit. All right, everybody. Hey, this was a great conversation. Thanks for joining us today. To all of our very valued listeners, we thank you for taking the time to listen to us. And if anybody ever has any questions about some of the topics we talk about, don't ever be afraid to reach out and contact TC Jacoby Company. We're always happy to help. Take care, everybody.
We welcome your participation in the Milk Check. If you have comments to share or questions you want answered, send an email to podcast@jacoby.com. Our theme music is composed and performed by Phil Kagi. The Milk Check is a production of TC Jacoby and Company.